Hello and welcome. We are going to take a look today at the Unit 2 lab and how to graph the data that you are provided, and then take a look at the relationship between the distance that the different islands are from the volcano at Kilauea compared to the elevation of each of those islands, and also look at the radioactive age of each of the islands and compare that to the distance from Kilauea. And we are going to be looking to see if we can identify any trends in that data. Let's get started by selecting what we want to graph. So you can see here I'm looking at the information about distance from Kilauea. I'm just going to select the information and I'm going to highlight that entire column, and then I'm going to press the control button. So I'm pressing control on my keyboard and I'm going to highlight the next column and select all of that data. And this is looking at the elevation. So we're going to be comparing the elevation of each of the islands in Hawaii, or each of the different volcanoes along the island chain, with the distance that that volcano is from the volcano at Kilauea. So once you have your data selected, we're going to go in Excel to the tab that says Insert. When we click on Insert in that toolbar, we have the option to insert different types of charts. I'm going to click on this drop-down menu just to show you the different options, but it might be the first one that you already have selected, and that's a scatter plot. As soon as I hover over it, the scatter plot appears on my screen. I'm going to click and it will create that plot for me. You can move it around, we can modify it, we can also change some things. So if your data looks like it is not showing the X and Y axes appropriately, you might have to go up here and click Switch Row and Column. If we do that, it gives us this really funny looking graph, and that's not what we're looking for. We see what looks to be a trend here, right? We can see a pattern in these lines, and it looks like a decreasing pattern. So we'll talk more about the pattern later. Let's look first at how to set up our graph. The title here isn't giving us a lot of information. We don't know what is on the X and Y axis, so let's see how we can add that in. I'm going to click on the plus sign to the right of the chart, and I want to add axis titles. And so it just leaves some blank spaces there that we can go and add. And we can also add things like trend lines. It doesn't do a great job of fitting the sort of exponential decay that we see, but we'll discuss it. And then once we go back into GoFormative, we can add it in by hand when we insert this graph into our whiteboard. So let's add in a title. What kind of information is on the x-axis? It's either the elevation or the distance. And so let's take a look at the numbers and see if that helps us kind of sort out what is what. The distance is our independent variable in this experiment. So distance is what we are kind of deciding. We're looking at the different distances, and then we are measuring how high the elevation is of each island, and then we're going to compare it to how far it is from Kilauea. So distance from Kilauea, and the unit is in kilometers. So I'm going to put km there. And then for the y-axis, it's what was measured in this experiment, or what the scientists determined. And so they determined the elevation of each island. And that was in meters. So we'll put m as the unit. I'm just going to drag that back up. Okay, and that is all that you need for that first graph. In the second part of your lab, you need to also graph the radioactive age, and that was determined by taking rock samples from each of the volcanic islands and using the amount of radioactive isotopes of different elements that are kind of left in those rocks, and coming up with an absolute age, or a sort of an approximate age. And MYA here stands for millions of years ago. So Kilauea says 0 millions of years ago. So this means that this is a relatively new volcano. It is still forming, or is in the process of kind of ending its formation. And so it is not old enough to really even register in this million of years ago data point. But we can see that these numbers are higher on some of these data points. So some of these islands were formed because the rocks of those islands show us that they were formed millions of years ago, 26 million years ago, 42 million years ago. And that's just by looking at the age of rock samples from volcanoes on those particular islands. So let's go ahead and see how we graph two data columns that are not adjacent to each other. I'm going to again select the distance from Kilauea, that same data column. I'm holding down the control button, and then I'm using my mouse to select this other column of data, the radioactive age. Again, I go back to where it says insert, and I click on the different types of charts. So I'm going to insert a scatter plot, and I'm just going to move this one so that we can make the same kind of modifications that we made to the first chart. Okay, we will go back and change the title. We also want to give it axis titles, and in this case, we're also going to add a trend line because this is going to kind of nicely fit with the data that we see. So just as before, the title for this axis is the distance from Kilauea in kilometers. So we're looking, each of these points represents one of the different volcanoes on the Hawaiian island chain. And the measurement that was taken here is the radioactive age. So it's the age of the rocks that make up the volcano, determined in how many millions of years ago they were formed. So, and let's change the title of our graphs too. Okay, so we're looking at the age of Hawaiian volcanoes compared to the distance from Kilauea. And here we are looking at the elevation of Hawaiian volcanoes compared to the distance from Kilauea. And when we can see patterns, when the points on our graph are not just scattered everywhere, when they fall into what looks to be a line, in this case, that's called a trend. And so we see a trend in this data. And it tells us that the further the distance is from Kilauea, the older the relative age is. So the islands that are further away from Kilauea on the map are older compared to the islands that are closer to Kilauea. And we're going to insert this. So I'm just going to click here on the chart itself. It automatically highlights the data to tell you where that chart's information came from. But I'm just going to highlight this, and I'm going to either right click and say copy, or you can do Control C, and then we can paste this chart into the whiteboard in GoFormative. I'll jump over to GoFormative in my next video and show you how to take your information and submit it on that GoFormative assessment. So keep up the great work. Let me know if you have any questions.